Race. It has become what many consider a dirty word in modern society. Some say we live in a post-racial society, calling discrimination a thing of the past. Yet this bias lives on today, with racial tension remaining a driving force in the world around us. From the war on drugs to the AIDS epidemic and police brutality, many of our greatest social challenges can be traced back to prejudice, discrimination, and hatred. I'm Anthony Monzon, and today we look beyond the confines and constructs of contemporary culture to bring you our world's most eminent issues in focus. Welcome to EIV News in Focus. Race has shaped our global landscape more than we could imagine, but few policies have had as massive an effect as the war on drugs. What many view as one of America's largest law enforcement failures has become something of a second prohibition, leading to a rise of drug cartels at home and abroad, and moreover, the widening economic divide between white and black communities. Today, over 50% of American prisoners are behind bars for drug charges, with 60% of all detainees being black. To make sense of these statistics, reporter Asta Tall has the story.
From the legalization of marijuana to the Department of Justice releasing 6,000 nonviolent drug offenders starting October 30th, attitudes towards drugs and addicts are changing. Talking to pro-marijuana activists, recovering addicts, and community organizers, as well as others, we got a view into the harmful effects of past approaches, as well as the possibilities a change in attitude could hold.
America hasn't always adhered to a zero-tolerance policy. In the early 80s, lawmakers decided to crack down on drug use and sale across the nation. An increased number of men, women, and young adults went to prison, majority of whom were people of color. Dr. Yasser Munif, a race relations professor at Emerson College, believes this is no mere coincidence.
71. And initially, the war on drugs started to criminalize the civil rights movement. We have to remember that the civil rights movement was very successful in achieving a number of victories, including the right to vote and desegregation and so on and so forth. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a white backlash. White were feeling that African Americans were getting access to the resources, that the white privilege was threatened, that they were getting affirmative action, and so on and so forth. And that white backlash took the form of the war on drugs as one of the ways it manifested itself. And this is why the war on drugs, since its beginning in 1971, was targeting mostly African American, was targeting the black spaces, the black neighborhoods, and was basically building the prison industrial complex.
So where did the shift from decriminalization to just say no arise? Why did majority of society join the bandwagon for harsher laws towards drug violations?
And since the beginning, obviously there was opposition to the criminalization of African American, and the idea was, the rational idea, the logical idea was that people who took drugs needed rehabilitation, not prison and punishment and violence. So by visiting that history, I think we can begin to see two movements in the US. One that was trying to get tough on crime. That's mostly the Republican, but not only the Republican. So for example, in 1994, Bill Clinton thought that the reason why the Democrats were losing elections in the past and so on was because they weren't tough enough on crime. And crime, for many of those politicians, meant and was equated to consumption and of drugs.
The war on drugs resulted in millions of incarcerations and caused America to have the most people behind bars in the world. Because of this, the country adopted a system to accept, process, and contain the influx of inmates.
Oftentimes, because African Americans are poor, they have a tendency to consume drugs in public spaces. as opposed to white consuming those same drugs in private spaces. So for the police, it's much easier to access and incarcerate or arrest African American. The second thing was the criminalization of the type of drugs consumed by African American as opposed to the type of drugs consumed by white. So the famous 101 ratio between the crack cocaine and powder cocaine is well known and well documented. And so, for example, if you possess 5 grams of crack cocaine, you can get the mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison, as opposed to having to possess half a kilo, 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same type of sentence. And all studies shows that most African American consume crack cocaine because it's much cheaper, and powder cocaine is mostly a white product. It's consumed by white, and was basically building the prison industrial complex.
The prison industrial complex runs one of the most efficient systems. Every year, thousands of private companies use the system to gain billions of dollars. The amount of money generated made the correction industry very profitable. With companies focused on profits, this can sometimes result in unjust imprisonment.
The idea was that we need to criminalize drugs. We need to pass laws that are harsher. And in addition to that, there is the prison industrial complex lobbying in Congress and the money that they give to politicians to maintain that kind of structure and make sure that there is a steady flow of inmates going to prison, whether they are juvenile or adults. This is why we ended up with the largest population in prison in the history of the world, with 2.3 million people behind bars in jails and prisons. And the criminalization was ongoing until recently because of a number of factors.
We went to Hope House and talked to Christopher Shields, a recovering addict. A former state trooper, before getting addicted to opioids, Chris robbed Boston area drugstores in order to get Oxycontin. A judge sentenced him to 10 to 12 years in jail. Shields shared his experience serving time with us.
When I was locked up, it was my second attempt at rehab, and I was at AdCare in Worcester, where I was finally arrested. It was my 3rd day of treatment there, and they were trying to wean me off the opiates with methadone. So I was on a full regimen of methadone, and I really don't have a clear memory of those 3 days. So when I was locked up, I was brought up to Cambridge, and at the time, they weren't treating for opiate addiction only. Well, OxyContin addiction. They're only treating if you were addicted to heroin. They would give you they call comfort drugs to assist you in withdrawal. So I had to withdraw from the opiates and the methadone on my own for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It took a while. It was just pure hell, Luckily, I was in a cell by myself, and it was just I could hardly stand, all the things you go through, withdrawal, all the things that kept me an addict for during that time when I was on my run. Now I had to suffer through those without anything, locked in a small cell.
The most overused and overabused drug in drugs in our society today are the legal ones. Nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana is, coming close to that now.
Prisons in America present many challenges, but once a person carries out their sentence, society punishes them for their past crimes. This sets up a roadblock for those trying to regain control. Potential employers and the general public hold strong stigmas, and the media has at times helped shape them. American news and media have not covered the war on drugs in an unbiased manner. Drug crimes were framed as an urban problem. Just the phrase itself conjures up images of gangs fighting for turf on the bad side of town. The notion of the bad side of town exists due to marginalization. The white middle class sees drug crimes as an external problem. In recent years, this perception may have changed.
So obviously the media is embedded in a racialized American society, and the media has its own biases. And since the beginning, the media tried to sell that war on drugs. And so, for example, since the beginning, the African American consumption of drugs is minoritarian. It's a minority compared to the overall population that consumes drugs. And yet, oftentimes, what you see in the media, in some cases, 90% of the people who are presented or represented in the media are African American, and you have all these buzzwords and discourses about people consuming drugs.
I absolutely believe that the reason that it's getting the publicity that it's getting is because it's now in the suburbs. It's no longer perceived in the suburbs to be an urban problem, which it was perceived to be. It was always out there, but young people in the suburbs, white middle class and upper class deaths, and people are angry, and so it's getting the publicity that it wouldn't have gotten it had it not spread the way it did.
For some, public perception is not the main problem. People with drug addictions struggle on a daily basis. A criminal record makes things worse. The government does offer recovery programs. Under Section 35, the state tries to help detox those suffering from dependency. But the number of beds offered remains low.
So the average stay, I think, ends up to be somewhere between 15 and 20 days in that committed locked unit. But again, a lot of times people will say, I really do have a problem and I need more help. And so the social workers will refer them to Hope House or to some other level of care that they think is appropriate. And again, so we keep those beds. They're not reserved for those folks. Yeah. So if there's nobody ready to come out of a commitment, we would put a regular street admission into that bed.
I've been to so many funerals. I've done quite a few eulogies. I've raised a lot of money for various funeral funds for people in this community. I've been at a lot of bedsides of people who were in comas because they were overdosed and they weren't, found in time. They were still alive, but barely. And so I always think about, why am I still here?
After being in recovery for so long, and then coming to the 6-month treatment program, people were saying, well, do you really need the 6-month treatment program? I almost had the same attitude, but I did, because I'm in a different world now. I'm back on the streets. I'm in Boston, in a section of Boston where drugs are rampant. You can go either way, 2 blocks, and get you whatever you want. There's a methadone clinic over at Boston Medical Center, and they call it the Methadone Mile. You go out there any morning, and you just see people either in a zombie state or exchanging prescriptions, exchanging drugs. It's pretty sad. Whereas years ago, I would take a harsh look at these people, but now I empathize with them.
The word and the name of the Turn It Around campaign is getting out there more and more, and so I know that there are other communities who are looking to the work that we do here with our youth so that they can implement similar strategies in their communities. I think it boosts the confidence of the youth, and it really it plants those seeds for when they're in those situations where there's a lot of peer pressure involved, and they can really think about that the work that they do here with the campaign and utilize that in their everyday lives.
I say quite often these days that my job has really changed a lot over the years, and particularly the last couple of years, from trying to help a person to get their life back under management to trying to make sure they're alive tomorrow morning when I get back here. It's I go back to the crack epidemic of the 80s, and I've never seen anything like I'm seeing today, never.
Well, we changed a lot of what we do here. We've provided more of everything, and over the years, Hope Houses has grown to provide outpatient services. When gentlemen complete the 6-month program, they're still engaged here through the outpatient department. And they're also still part of the alumni program. So they're welcome to come back here anytime. I really try to promote that because they've completed the program and it's really about paying it forward. So the folks that have been able to get a handle on their disease, I really would like them to come back to share with the guys that are here now as to how they did that and what it takes.
The Hope House taught me that be patient, because addiction is patient. And it waited for me for 40 years of my life. I think I was always an addict. I never gave it an opportunity to take over my life until I was 40 years old. And that perfect storm of circumstances took over my life, being out injured, and the thought of having to retire on disability, not getting back in the job that I love so much, and which supported my family so well.
Today, facilities such as Hope House struggle to balance the need for care and the low amount of beds available. The heroin epidemic affects young people at a much higher rate, and they seek these beds for rehabilitation. This epidemic hits not only poor urban areas, but the white picket fences of the middle class.
Heroin cannot be racialized in the same way. African American are not necessarily the prime consumers of heroin.
Heroin is extremely prevalent on the streets and is very cheap. So it was a natural progression where people would start to snort it, much like they did in the 80s and 90s with cocaine, and then progressed to the point where they started shooting IV.
So like when you start out having a few drinks at the age of 12, 13, because you think it's just a phase and it's just kind of like what all kids do at that age. And so a lot of kids, when they start out having their first drink at that age, then they progress to like the marijuana, the pills, like the club drugs. And during that time, during the OxyContin epidemic, kids just went from drinking right to OxyContin because there were all these pills on the street. And so in their minds, they thought, well, doctors prescribe these, so it can't be that bad, and not really realizing what they were getting into. And I really believe that that is a big reason for where we're at right now.
Yeah, the typical person that's coming in now is probably in the 24, 25-year-old as opposed to the 35 or 40-year-old. There was a point in time where if you told me what street you grew up on, I could tell you what you were using for a drug, you know what I mean? Different communities and cultures had them. Today it's heroin everywhere, everywhere.
I think I'm a perfect example of how the addiction does not discriminate, no matter where you're from, what background you're from.
Each day, more people get addicted to heroin. Government facilities struggle to keep a pace. Other programs, such as the Charlestown Substance Abuse Coalition, aim to help fill the vacuum. The program centers on young people educating their peers about the dangers of drug use. They shape the programming as well as engage in community outreach.
So we have to be able to have some step-down services for these folks. We need to be able to get them onto a medically assisted treatment program, Suboxone, Methadone, Vivitrol, something that will keep their levels okay and not, if they did use, it would block any high so that they wouldn't die.
The coalition was formed in 2004 as a response to the opiate overdose epidemic. At one point, Charlestown had the highest fatal overdose rate in Massachusetts, and Charlestown's only 1 square mile. The coalition has expanded in a lot of different ways, not just with direct care, which is what I do, is I connect direct services and connect folks to the appropriate level of care, and also do treatment coordination for the Charlestown Drug Court, and do a lot of education around Narcan and signs and symptoms and overdose prevention basics. But we also have a lot of prevention and education work that we do in the schools. We have a youth prevention campaign.
I do see people talking about it, which I hadn't seen before. I was fortunate enough, I sat on the governor's opiate task force all winter and spring, so I got to talk to a lot of the county sheriffs across the state. Got to travel across the state to talk to a lot of people that are in the business. So we are all talking, and that's good, but at some point there has to be action.
Now you can see very critical pieces in the New York Times or Time magazine, whereas just a few years ago, those same media were criminalizing and targeting and attacking African American and celebrating the war on drugs, and basically seeing only the positive aspects or believing in the dominant discourse about ending violence and chaos.
Changing laws and attitudes only address part of the problem, but these victories address the symptoms of a diseased system. Widespread systematic and institutional changes to the system need to be implemented in order for there to be a truly better future. Let us go back to Anthony Monzon for some final details.
Opioids have recently been brought into the public spotlight, with overdose cases nearly quadrupling since the turn of the century. While lawmakers are taking steps to keep litigation medical rather than criminal, some scholars are calling the nation's response racially based, as large numbers of overdose cases are reported to be white males. So what do you think? You've heard the opinions of experts and the testimony of many involved. Now we want to hear from you. Tweet us at EIV in Focus using the hashtag RaceInFocus to send us your questions and comments to be discussed at the end of the season. You know the issues, now the next step is yours. I'm Anthony Monzon, signing off.